Our siblings are usually some of the closest family we can have. Despite occasionally falling out, if asked, we'd like to think we would do anything for them. However, on February the 2nd, 1933, Léa Papin's sister asked her to do the unthinkable, and she and her sister's actions that night would send shockwaves across France. In today's episode of Well I Never, we explore the case of Christine and Léa Papin, two sisters who committed one of the grisliest crimes in French history. The childhood of the Papin sisters was far from ideal. Clémence Déré and Gustave Papin had issues long before their first child, Emilia, was born in 1902. Rumours about Clémence having an affair with her employer were whispered around Le Mans, and Gustave wasn't deaf to them. Still, the two would marry when Clémence discovered she was pregnant. Gustave, however, couldn't let go of the feelings of betrayal and decided the family should move to another city for a fresh start. To that end, he found a job in another city, but Clémence was so set against moving and announced she would rather take her own life than be forced to leave Le Mans. Although it was clear the marriage wasn't working, with Clémence suffering from depression and Gustave sinking deep into alcoholism, the couple had their second child, Christine, in 1905. Unable to care for another baby, the Papins sent Christine to live with Gustave's sister and her husband. 6 more years passed, with Christine growing up in the calm and settled atmosphere of her aunt's household, unaware of the horrors her older sister was enduring back at the Papin family home. The youngest daughter, Léa, was born in 1911. It was soon after that Clémence and Gustave's marriage finally ended. Around the time Emilia was 9 or 10 years old, her mother allegedly found out Gustave had abused their daughter. But instead of becoming enraged at her husband's disgusting crime, her mind twisted the situation, and she instead felt jealousy, believing Emilia had seduced Gustave. As a result, Emilia was sent to live in the notoriously strict and oppressive Bon Pasteur Catholic orphanage, and was soon joined by her sister Christine, who Clémence removed from a loving home for unknown reasons. And though Léa was initially placed in the care of Clémence's brother, when he died, she joined her sisters at Bon Pasteur. This wasn't an unusual situation in France at the time. In the years prior to this point, it's thought that in some cities, up to 20% of newborns were placed into orphanages. Despite Clémence being unwilling or unable to mother and support her children, she didn't plan to leave the 3 sisters in the orphanage forever. Her plan was to wait until they reached working age and were able to bring her money. So when Emilia and Christine began to state they had received the calling and wished to enter a convent to become nuns, Clémence panicked. She removed Léa and Christine from the orphanage, but Emilia had already taken her vows at the convent and would remain there. Not much is known about Emilia's life after this point, but it's safe to say her sisters' futures would be starkly different to her own. As each turned 15, Clémence hired Léa and Christine out as live-in maids. Christine was described as a hard worker, but a bit headstrong at times. Meanwhile, Léa was considered extremely obedient, much quieter and more withdrawn than her older sister. Whenever possible, the girls requested to work together so that they could speak with each other in their spare time. Although the two had grown up apart, Christine and Léa quickly formed a strong bond, with both having a difficult relationship with their mother and the work environment changing daily. The sisters were the only constant in each other's lives. The quality of the girls' work was beyond reproach. However, they would often change employers as Clémence sought better pay for them and herself. In 1926, the Papin sisters landed a well-paying job which they would stay at for several years. While things started well, this placement would end in the bloody and brutal death of their employers. That year, Christine started working as a maid for the Lancelin family at 6 Rue Bruyère. Monsieur René Lancelin was a retired solicitor who lived with his wife, Madame Léonie Lancelin, and their younger daughter, Geneviève, in a large townhouse near the centre of Paris. Christine knew the Lancelins didn't have any problem paying for multiple maids, and so, after 6 months of impeccable work, she convinced her employer to hire Léa. The sisters thrived at 6 Rue Bruyère. Christine and Léa worked hard and were initially treated very well. They were paid standard wages, offered the same food as the family, and slept in a room with 2 twin beds, a heater and a balcony. The Lancelins were delighted with their dedicated employees, whom other upper-class French households envied. Without a positive mother figure in their lives, Christine and Léa became close with Madame Lancelin, whom they called Maman. Meanwhile, Clémence was only referred to as that woman. It's reported that Madame Lancelin even contacted Clémence to inform her Christine and Léa would keep their wages from now on and stop sending them to their mother. This could have been a new start for the sisters in a home where they were valued, and for a while it was. But things began to change in 1932. Around this time, Léonie fell into a deep depression that affected her personality. She went from being warm and motherly toward Christine and Léa to a cold and distant employer who only communicated with her maids through written notes. She would also become much more critical of the work done and would be said to check surfaces with a white glove. Eventually, things got so bad, Léonie would scream at the sisters if they missed a spot, and her relationship with the sisters deteriorated further when she began to physically assault them. The woman, who had become the girls' mother figure, would slam Christine and Léa's heads against a wall if they failed to complete tasks to her standards. This kind of abuse affects anyone, but considering the Papin sisters' troubled background, it was just a matter of time before the situation would come to a head. On Thursday, February the 2nd, 1933, that's exactly what happened. The day started much like any other, with 27-year-old Christine and 21-year-old Léa busy with chores and errands, while Léonie and Geneviève were out on a shopping trip. The family would then be having dinner with René's brother, who lived nearby, later that evening. The Papin sisters may have felt relieved that they could set about their chores without Madame Lancelin's judging eye looking over them. One of Christine's jobs that day was ironing the Lancelins' garments. A faulty iron had stopped her from tackling the pile of clothes, but earlier that morning she had collected the repaired item from an electrician. Now fixed, she set about her task. However, when she plugged the appliance in and switched it on, it immediately blew a fuse, and the Lancelin home fell into darkness. Christine and Léa reasoned that the Lancelins would not return home early anyway, so the fuse could easily wait until the morning before being fixed. Unfortunately, Léonie and Geneviève decided to swing by the house on their way to dinner. This decision would have fatal consequences. Christine tried to explain what had transpired to Madame Lancelin, but rather than being understanding, Léonie flew into a violent rage, as she had done many times before. The argument escalated until Christine snapped, picking up a heavy pitcher and hitting Léonie with it. This action was the point of no return, and the rage that had built up in the sisters would now be unleashed in a most foul and brutal fashion. As Christine set about Léonie, Geneviève arrived to try and defend her mother. She pulled the elder Papin sister away from her mother, and the pair began to tussle. While Léonie lay injured on the floor, Christine shouted to her sister, "Smash her head into the ground and tear her eyes out." The always obedient Léa followed her sister's orders and gouged Léonie's eyes out, while Christine did the same to Geneviève. Now blind and in unimaginable agony, Léonie and Geneviève were helpless, but the sisters' fury was still not quelled. Christine ran to the kitchen to fetch items, including a knife and a hammer to use on the Lancelins. The sisters' frenzied attack lasted over half an hour, long after Léonie and Geneviève had died. The Papin sisters swapped weapons back and forth between them as they brutalized the bodies, only stopping when they became tired. When they were done, instead of running away, the pair calmly locked the front door of the Lancelin home, removed their blood-soaked clothes and retired to their bedroom. At 7 p.m, René returned home and found the house in darkness. Thinking his wife and daughter had already made their way to his brother's house, he too made his way there. He quickly discovered they were not there either and was further perplexed when he returned home to find the front door bolted shut. Monsieur Lancelin contacted police, who then forced their way into the building. Once inside, officers made a gruesome discovery on the second floor of the home: the unrecognizable remains of Léonie and Geneviève. Blood and gore filled the hallway, and on the stairs to the upper level of the house lay a single eye. It was initially feared the two maids had met the same fate. The police made their way to the sisters' room, only to find it locked. A locksmith was called out, and upon opening the door, it was reported that they found Léa and Christine clinging to each other, naked in bed. Once questioned, the Papin sisters immediately confessed to the murder, but claimed it had been committed in self-defense, Christine stating, "It was her or us." Surprisingly, despite the incredible cruelty of the crime, the public sympathized with the Papin sisters as the news of the brutal murder spread around France. The deaths of Madame Léonie Lancelin and her daughter Geneviève were seen as a result of the class struggle between the rich and the poor. Even prominent intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir and Jean Genet described the incident as an example of class warfare. During the trial, the strange connection between the two sisters became apparent. Both were quiet and unmoved during the proceedings. Christine seemed almost to fall asleep while Léa would stare into space until her name was mentioned. The pair had an unusually close relationship, but Christine was very much the leader and Léa would follow every direction her elder sibling gave her. It was also revealed that the sisters had managed to save 23,000 francs, roughly $22,000 in today's money. This was around 4 times the pair's combined annual earnings. It seems the women just didn't spend money. They didn't treat themselves, didn't go to shows or travel on their days off. Instead, they spent every free moment in each other's company. As they had admitted to the crime, their defense argued the Papin sisters were insane. They began listing the family history with an uncle who had taken his life, a violent grandfather, and a cousin who had died in an asylum, and of course Christine and Léa's abusive upbringing. It was also reported that their mother had become a religious mystic whose practices verged on hysteria. Psychological experts would later argue that the Papin sisters suffered from a condition called folie à deux, shared psychosis. Both persons typically act paranoid, fearful and suspicious of others and can become defensive and angry if challenged. The primary person in the relationship, in this case Christine, is unaware of the fact that they are making the other person ill. However, despite the family history and rather clear signs of mental illness, especially with Christine, the jury eventually found the sisters sane and guilty. Because it was believed Léa took part in the murder under the influence of her older sister, she was given a lighter sentence, 10 years of hard labour. Christine, however, was initially sentenced to death at the guillotine, but her sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Upon being separated from her sister in prison, it's said that Christine had a violent outburst and demanded to be reunited with her. When she eventually calmed, she is said to have told a jailer, quote, "In some future life, I think I shall be Léa's husband," end quote. The debate about the nature of Christine and Léa's relationship has continued ever since, with some believing the two were in an incestuous sexual relationship. Others say the sisters were devoted to each other simply because of family ties and a shared traumatic childhood. In any case, after being separated from Léa in prison, Christine's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. She had an episode in July 1933, during which she tried to gouge her own eyes out, and after her continued pleas to see Léa went unanswered, Christine stopped eating. As a result, she died of cachexia or wasting away on May 18th, 1937. Léa would serve 8 years before she was released and presumably continued working as a maid under a false identity. Without her sister, she lived the rest of her life without further incident. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, "Well, I never."